The day we arrived in America, nothing could have prepared me for what I saw. Sarah Fisher never imagined that this statement would capture the essence of everything that awaited her. As the ship docked in the United States, she stood at the edge of the gangplank, her legs unsteady after weeks at sea. The air was thick with humidity, a sharp contrast to the dry, cold winds of her homeland. The American shore stretched before her, bathed in the golden light of dawn, and for a moment, Sarah hesitated. She had heard the stories. She had been trained to expect the worst, a harsh land filled with ruthless enemies. But nothing could have prepared her for the overwhelming shock that hit her the moment her boots touched the ground. The soldiers who greeted them were nothing like what she had been told. Tall, strong, but their faces carried none of the hatred she had expected. Among them was a black American soldier, standing tall with his rifle at ease, his expression calm and unyielding. Sarah's heart raced. The propaganda had lied to her. She had been taught to believe that America was a land of chaos, where even the soldiers were no different from animals. But here, the American soldiers were composed, their faces not filled with anger but with something else, something Sarah could hardly understand at the time, compassion. She looked around, and the contrast was just as shocking. Where in Germany the air had always felt oppressive, here it was different. The sky above was so vast, so clear, it made her feel small and insignificant. She had expected a barren land filled with destruction, but what she saw was a country full of life, prosperity, and tranquility. The lush fields and quiet homes seemed like something out of a dream. As she and the other women POWs were led to their temporary quarters, Sarah couldn't help but stare in disbelief. The barracks were simple, but they were clean and spacious. No barbed wire, no armed guards shouting orders. Just the quiet hum of life going on as if the war was happening far, far away. They were treated with a surprising amount of care. After the long journey, the food they were offered, hot meals, fresh bread, and even fruit, was unlike anything Sarah had imagined. She had been prepared for starvation, but here she was, eating a meal that tasted like something she had only read about in the rare, censored articles that made it past the German press. It was a strange feeling. The comfort was almost too much to bear. As Sarah sat down to eat, she realized how hungry she truly was, not just for food, but for normalcy. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't just a prisoner of war. She was treated like a human being. It was as though the chains that bound her for so long, both physically and mentally, had been broken. Sarah looked around at the other women in the room. Some of them were still hesitant, still unsure of their surroundings. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had known was being turned upside down. The kindness she was receiving was something she had never expected from the very people her country had painted as the enemy. It was a small act, a simple meal, yet it had the power to reshape everything. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice, a soft, but firm tone calling her name. It was one of the American soldiers, asking if she needed anything else. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She was so used to the harshness of her captors that this gentleness was something she couldn't yet fully comprehend. She nodded, too stunned to speak. As the soldier walked away, she realized she wasn't in a nightmare. This was real. She was in America, a place she had been taught to fear. But instead of hatred, she was met with humanity. And nothing could have prepared her for that. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside the window. The air was thick with humidity, a stark contrast to the cold, damp mornings she had grown accustomed to in Germany. The room she was assigned to was sparse but comfortable, a far cry from the cramped quarters she had expected. She sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. The bed was simple, but the sheets were clean, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah could feel the weight of exhaustion lifting from her shoulders. She had expected fear, suspicion, and hardship, but so far, all she had encountered were simple acts of kindness. As she made her way outside, the morning sun beat down on her, and she was struck by how different everything looked. The landscape stretched endlessly before her, vast, open fields of green, with the distant hum of machinery from nearby farms. It was beautiful, and yet, it felt almost unreal. She had been told America was a land of chaos, but this was something entirely different. She watched as soldiers moved through the camp, their movements calm and purposeful. No one shouted orders, no one seemed rushed. It was as though time moved at a slower pace here, a far cry from the constant tension and urgency she had known back home. As Sarah walked toward the mess hall, she felt a sense of unease settle in. She had been fed well the night before, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something would happen, some unexpected twist that would shatter the peace she had found. But when she entered the mess hall, all those worries seemed to vanish. The long tables were filled with food, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter, and fresh fruit. She had never seen anything like it. She had expected to be given the bare minimum, perhaps some stale bread and water, but this was a feast. The smells filled the room, making her stomach growl in anticipation. As she took a seat at one of the tables, she felt a pair of eyes on her. She looked up and saw the same soldier who had greeted her the day before. His name was James, and he had a quiet confidence about him. He smiled at her as he approached, a small gesture that somehow made her feel more at ease. "You look like you could use some coffee," he said, his voice calm and steady. Sarah nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had never been spoken to this way by anyone in authority before, let alone a soldier from the enemy camp. But there was no trace of hostility in his demeanor, just a simple kindness that she couldn't yet fully comprehend. James poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her. She took a sip, the warmth of the liquid spreading through her chest. It was rich, smooth, and comforting, everything that had been missing from her life for so long. For a moment, she simply sat there, savoring the taste. It was a strange feeling, to be treated with such respect. She had been a prisoner of war, and yet, here she was, sitting at a table like any other person. No one had treated her as a prisoner. It was as if the war, the hatred, the labels, had all been erased in this one simple act. As Sarah finished her breakfast, she felt a shift inside her. The fear that had gripped her the moment she stepped off the ship was starting to fade, replaced by something else, a flicker of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she felt like there was a chance for something better. She looked up at James once more, and this time, she saw something in his eyes, something kind, something understanding. It was the first real connection she had felt since she arrived, and it made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, this land she had been taught to fear wasn't as terrifying as she had been led to believe. Sarah stepped outside the mess hall, her mind swirling with thoughts she couldn't quite put together. The morning had been like a dream, so unlike the nightmares of captivity she had been prepared for. She had expected fear and punishment, yet all she found was a sense of strange calm. The guards, the soldiers, none of them looked at her with the hatred she had imagined. In fact, they didn't seem to look at her at all, not as a prisoner. They treated her like an equal, like someone who mattered. She walked slowly, the sun's rays warming her face as she moved toward the small group of women she had arrived with. They were gathered near the barracks, speaking quietly amongst themselves, still unsure of the world around them. Sarah's heart ached for them. They were all in the same boat, but each one of them seemed trapped in their own fears, their own suspicions. She understood that feeling well. She had carried it for so long. But she couldn't deny the change she had felt within herself since arriving. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was someone who had been seen, someone who had been treated with kindness. It was an unsettling thought. It meant that everything she had known about the enemy, everything she had been taught to believe, might be wrong. She stopped in her tracks as a small, wiry soldier approached. He was carrying a bucket of water, his boots kicking up dust with each step. He had the same calm demeanor as the others, but there was something in his eyes that caught her attention. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was different. "You need anything, ma'am?" he asked, his voice polite but not overly formal. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to being asked if she needed something. She wasn't used to people caring. She shook her head, offering a small smile. "No, thank you," she replied softly, her voice still catching in her throat. The soldier nodded and moved on, but Sarah stood there for a moment longer, her mind racing. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about this place that made her feel human again. She walked back to the barracks and sat on the edge of the cot. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to fold the blanket neatly. It felt good to do something as simple as make the bed, something she had taken for granted before the war. She looked out the window and saw the soldiers moving through the camp, their movements efficient, purposeful, but not harsh. They weren't the monsters she had imagined. The longer she stayed, the more it became clear that they were just people, doing their jobs, just like her. And in that moment, Sarah realized that she had been wrong about everything. She had been wrong about the war, about the enemy, and about herself. The war had torn everything apart, but here, in this strange land, she could see the possibility of healing. She could see the chance for something better, something beyond the war, beyond the hatred. She was no longer just a prisoner. She was a person again. Sarah woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside her barracks window. It was a strange noise to her, so different from the sounds of bombings and the harsh calls of military officers that had filled her days in captivity. She stretched slowly, taking in the warm morning light that filtered through the thin curtains. The air smelled fresh, almost sweet, unlike the heavy, polluted air she had left behind in Europe. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: peace. She stood up and walked to the small wooden table in the corner of her room. It was covered with simple items: pens, a notepad, and a small vase with a single flower in it. Everything about the place was so different from what she had been told to expect. It was almost hard to believe she was still a prisoner of war. The soft hum of activity outside the barracks reached her ears. Soldiers were moving about, but the tension she had expected to feel wasn't there. They weren't shouting orders, nor were they glaring at her as if she was an enemy. Instead, they walked with purpose, but not with hostility. They looked like people doing their jobs, nothing more, nothing less. It was hard to reconcile this version of the Americans with the one she had been raised to fear. She had been told stories of cruelty, of unrelenting violence. Yet, what she saw here was different. People smiled at each other, worked side by side, and offered help without hesitation. It was as if kindness was a part of the daily routine. Sarah knew she wasn't free, but there was something liberating about being treated like a person again. The thought was foreign to her, yet it filled her with an undeniable sense of gratitude. As she stepped outside the barracks, she noticed a few other women walking nearby. They were talking in low voices, some of them still uncertain about their situation, others quietly hopeful. Sarah joined them, and they walked together toward the small garden area that had been set up for them. It was a simple space, just a few rows of vegetables and some flowers, but it was enough to make Sarah feel grounded. She knelt down, her fingers brushing against the soil as she helped water the plants. The earthy scent of the ground filled her senses, and for a moment, she forgot she was in a foreign country, surrounded by strangers. In this small garden, she found a kind of comfort. As Sarah stood up, wiping her hands on her trousers, she noticed a soldier standing nearby, watching her. It was James. He had a small, friendly smile on his face as he approached. "How's the garden coming along?" he asked, his voice warm and steady. Sarah smiled back, feeling a strange sense of connection to him. "It's coming along just fine," she replied, her accent still thick but softening with each day. James nodded, taking a step closer. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when I'd be watching German POWs tending a garden on an American base," he said with a quiet chuckle. Sarah laughed softly, a sound that surprised her. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she truly laughed. "Neither did I," she said. There was a pause, but it wasn't uncomfortable. James looked at her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "If you ever need anything, anything at all, don't hesitate to ask," he said. The sincerity in his voice caught Sarah off guard. She nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. She had never experienced such kindness from a soldier, and it made her question everything she thought she knew about her captors. As they stood there in the quiet garden, the sounds of the camp echoing in the distance, Sarah realized that maybe, just maybe, this was a place where she could start over. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope, something that had been lost to her for far too long. Sarah had spent the last few days trying to absorb everything she had encountered since arriving in America, but nothing could quite prepare her for the next unexpected turn. It was a cool evening, and after a long day of light chores around the camp, she found herself walking along a path near the fields where the soldiers often worked. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant mix of colors as the sun dipped low on the horizon. The peacefulness of the scene was almost overwhelming. It was the kind of beauty that reminded her of her childhood, of simpler times before the war, before everything had fallen apart. As she walked, Sarah couldn't help but notice the laughter of the soldiers in the distance. They were gathered around a small bonfire, the warmth of the flames dancing on their faces. It was a simple, peaceful scene, but it felt so foreign to her. She had been taught that these men were her enemies, yet here they were, just people, sharing stories and enjoying the warmth of the fire. The realization hit her again, like it had every day since her arrival. She had been wrong. She had been wrong about so much. She could no longer see these men as her captors. They were human beings, doing what they had to do, just like her. As she continued walking, Sarah saw James sitting alone at the edge of the fire. His posture was relaxed, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable for a moment before he smiled. "I didn't expect to see you out here," he said, his voice calm but warm. Sarah hesitated, unsure of what to say. She had gotten used to talking with him, but something about the setting felt different, more intimate. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, offering a small shrug. "The quiet out here, it's peaceful." James nodded, motioning to the spot beside him. "It's a good place to think," he said softly. Sarah sat down beside him, close enough to feel the warmth of the fire but not so close that it felt uncomfortable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat in silence, watching the flames flicker and dance. Sarah's mind wandered, and she found herself thinking about home, about Germany, about the life she once knew. She had never imagined this moment, sitting beside an American soldier, feeling calm. Feeling human again. Finally, James broke the silence. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "Is everything okay?" Sarah looked at him, surprised by the tenderness in his voice. She had never expected a soldier to care, especially not one from the country she had been taught to fear. "I'm just adjusting," she replied, her words slow, as if testing the truth in them. "Everything is so different here." "I can imagine," James said, his tone understanding. "But you seem to be adjusting just fine." Sarah smiled softly, not quite believing him, but feeling a warmth spread through her chest at the sincerity in his words. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The fire crackled beside them, the only sound breaking the silence that hung between them. For the first time since arriving, Sarah felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It had been so long since she allowed herself to hope, to believe that there might be something good left in the world. But sitting here, in the quiet glow of the fire, with someone who had shown her nothing but kindness, Sarah began to believe it again. The future was still uncertain, and she didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But in this moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, peace. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten, and one that she was beginning to think she could keep. And maybe, just maybe, it was a sign that things could be different. That she could be different. The days that followed were a blur of unexpected moments, small but significant. Sarah had started to feel more like herself again, a woman, not just a prisoner. Every morning, she worked alongside the other women in the camp's makeshift garden, helping to plant vegetables and tend to the plants. She had never thought she would find solace in something so simple, but the act of caring for something, of nurturing life, gave her a sense of purpose that she hadn't realized she had been missing. The soldiers, mostly quiet during the day, would often pass by, offering small smiles or nods. Sarah had learned that even the smallest gestures could carry meaning in a place like this. One afternoon, as she watered the rows of tomatoes, she noticed James approaching again. He was carrying a basket filled with what looked like freshly picked apples. "Thought you might like a snack," he said, offering the basket to her. Sarah looked at the apples, their bright red skin a stark contrast to the dull, dusty landscape around them. She had forgotten what real fruit tasted like. "Thank you," she replied, reaching out to take one. As she bit into the crisp, sweet fruit, she felt something stir within her, a sense of normalcy, a feeling she had thought was lost forever. She looked up at James, surprised by the emotion that was welling up inside her. "It's strange," she said softly, "how something so simple can make you feel so human again." James gave a small smile, sitting down beside her on the edge of the garden. "Yeah, I get that," he said, his voice steady. "Sometimes it's the little things that remind us what it means to live, not just survive." Sarah nodded, her eyes drifting over the camp, taking in the small details that had become so familiar to her in the short time she had been there. The soldiers working in the fields, the prisoners tending to the garden, the quiet hum of life continuing despite the chaos of the war. It was almost as if time had slowed down here. The noise of the world beyond the camp, the constant tension of the war, seemed far away. It felt like a different life, one she could almost imagine as her own. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to think about a future that wasn't filled with fear. She didn't know what that future would look like, whether she would ever return home, or if she would stay here, working on this land, but in this moment, she didn't need to know. The thought of being able to choose for herself, to have the opportunity to rebuild her life, was something she had not allowed herself to consider until now. James stood up after a moment, stretching his legs. "I should get back to work," he said, but before he walked away, he looked at Sarah one last time. "You know, I'm glad you're here," he said. His words were simple, but they carried more weight than she had expected. "I think we're all here for a reason, even if we don't understand it yet." Sarah watched him walk back toward the soldiers, his figure disappearing into the distance. She sat there for a long time, finishing her apple, lost in thought. She had always believed that people were defined by their past, by the roles they played in the world. But here, in this strange land, she was beginning to see things differently. Maybe people could be more than their circumstances. Maybe they could be defined by their actions, by the choices they made, no matter how small. And as Sarah stood up to return to the barracks, she realized that she was no longer just a prisoner of war. She was someone who had been given a second chance, a chance to rediscover what it meant to be human again. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah found herself settling into a routine she never thought she would experience. The work was simple, tending to the garden, cleaning, cooking meals with the other women, but it gave her a sense of purpose. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a step toward reclaiming something that had been lost in the chaos of war. As the weeks passed, Sarah began to notice the small ways in which the camp had changed her. She was no longer just a prisoner, waiting for the war to end. She was learning to live again. It wasn't just the work that brought her peace. It was the conversations she had with the other women, the quiet moments spent watching the sunset, and the occasional visit from James, who always had a smile and a kind word for her. He was different from the soldiers she had imagined, gentle, patient, and always willing to listen. One afternoon, as she sat by the garden, James approached her, carrying a small package wrapped in cloth. "I thought you might like this," he said, his voice soft. Sarah looked at him, surprised. "What is it?" she asked. He smiled and placed the package in her hands. When she unwrapped it, she found a small book, worn at the edges, the pages yellowed with age. "I thought you might enjoy reading," he said. "It's a collection of poems from an American author. I remember my mother reading it to me when I was a kid. Thought it might bring you some comfort." Sarah looked at the book, touched by the gesture. It was something small, but it meant more to her than words could express. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching in her throat. "I'll treasure it." James nodded, then turned to leave, but before he did, he paused. "You know," he said, "sometimes, it's the smallest things that make the biggest difference." Sarah watched him walk away, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. It wasn't the grand gestures that changed the world, it was the quiet acts of kindness, the small moments of humanity that made the difference. As she sat there, holding the book in her hands, Sarah realized that she had been wrong about so many things. She had thought that the war defined her, that the past defined her. But now, sitting here in this foreign land, she could see that it was the choices she made, the way she treated others, that truly mattered. She wasn't a victim of war. She was a woman rebuilding her life, one small step at a time. That night, as Sarah sat in the barracks, she began to read the poems in the book James had given her. The words were simple, but they filled her with a sense of peace she had never known. As she read, she felt the weight of her past lifting, bit by bit. The war was still there, lurking in the background, but it no longer held the same power over her. She was no longer just a prisoner of war. She was a person again, with hopes, dreams, and the ability to choose her own path. And as the days passed, Sarah found herself looking forward to the future, to the possibility of a life beyond the war, beyond the prison camps. A life where she could be free, free to live, to love, and to find happiness once more. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of life in the camp had begun to settle into something familiar. The work remained simple, but Sarah found herself more at ease with it every day. She spent hours tending to the garden, reading the book James had given her, and sharing quiet conversations with the other women. It was a strange sense of normalcy, one she had never expected to find in a place like this. Yet, as the days grew warmer and the seasons began to shift, something inside Sarah began to change as well. She was no longer just passing through each day. She was living. One morning, as Sarah was walking toward the garden, she noticed James standing by the camp's small shed, talking to one of the other soldiers. He turned as she approached, his face lighting up with a smile. "Morning," he said, his voice as warm as ever. "I was just about to head out to the fields. Want to come along?" Sarah paused, her mind racing. She had been spending most of her time in the garden or the barracks, and the thought of stepping outside the camp was a little daunting. But the invitation felt genuine, and something inside her urged her to step beyond the routine. "I'd like that," she replied, surprising herself with how quickly the words came. They walked side by side toward the edge of the camp, where the field stretched out before them, green and alive under the bright sun. The air was filled with the scent of earth and fresh growth, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a sense of connection to the land beneath her feet. The work was simple, harvesting crops, gathering vegetables, but it felt like something more. It felt like a part of her life was returning. As they worked, Sarah found herself talking with James more freely than she ever had before. They spoke about everything and nothing, about their lives before the war, about their hopes for the future, and even about the small things that made the days a little brighter. She learned that James had grown up on a farm in Oklahoma, that he loved the quiet moments of early mornings and the smell of freshly cut grass. She shared stories of her childhood in Germany, of the small town where she had once dreamed of becoming a teacher. The conversation came easily, and as they worked together, Sarah realized that the bond between them had grown in ways she had never expected. It wasn't just the small acts of kindness that had changed her view of the world, it was the connection they shared, the simple act of understanding each other in a way that transcended borders and backgrounds. That afternoon, as the sun began to dip low in the sky, James turned to Sarah with a thoughtful look on his face. "You know," he said, "I never expected to be working with someone like you. I mean, I thought you'd be, well, different." Sarah raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. "Different how?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. James shrugged, his eyes meeting hers. "I guess I expected you to be more like what I've been told. Like the others, resentful, angry. But you're not. You've got this quiet strength about you. It's refreshing." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had been told that the world would see her as nothing more than a soldier's enemy, that she would be hated. Misunderstood. But James saw something different. He saw her as a person, not just a prisoner. "I guess we're all a little different than what we're told," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe we should all remember that." They stood there for a moment, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows over the fields. In that moment, Sarah felt something stir inside her, a sense of hope, of possibility. It was a fleeting thought, one she couldn't quite grasp, but it was there, buried deep inside her. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Maybe, despite everything, there was still a chance for a future, one where she wasn't defined by her past, one where she could be free. As she looked out at the fields before her, Sarah knew that she wasn't there yet, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to reach for it. She wasn't afraid to hope. As the days grew longer, Sarah found herself stepping into a new chapter of her life, one that she had never imagined could exist after everything she had endured. She had come to the camp as a prisoner, but somewhere between the simple tasks, the quiet moments with the other women, and the gentle kindness of the soldiers, she had begun to feel something different. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The seasons had begun to shift, and with them, the rhythm of the camp had evolved. The work had become more familiar, and Sarah found herself enjoying the simplicity of it all. She spent her mornings in the garden, her afternoons helping with meals, and her evenings reading or sitting by the small fire with the others. There were still moments of doubt, of course, moments when the weight of her past would creep in, reminding her of the life she had lost. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. The camp had become her world now, and the people here had become her new family. One evening, as the sun began to set and the camp settled into the quiet of dusk, Sarah found herself standing near the edge of the camp, looking out over the fields. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and the wind carried the faint scent of flowers and fresh earth. She had always found peace in the quiet moments, and tonight was no different. She could hear footsteps behind her and turned to see James approaching. He had a relaxed smile on his face, and he moved with the ease of someone who had long since accepted the rhythm of the land. "I thought I might find you out here," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's a nice evening for it." Sarah smiled, her heart warming at the sight of him. "It is," she agreed softly. "I've always liked sunsets. They remind me of home." James nodded, his gaze following hers to the horizon. "I understand. There's something about them, isn't there? They make you feel like anything is possible." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. There was something in his expression that was different now, something that she had seen growing between them over time. "James," she said, her voice quieter than usual, "do you ever think about what happens after this? After the war?" He paused, his gaze lingering on the fading light. "All the time," he said, his tone thoughtful. "I don't know what comes next, but I've started to think that maybe it's not about what happens. Maybe it's about how we live in the meantime." Sarah's heart fluttered at his words, and for a moment, the weight of everything she had been through seemed to lift. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that instant, she realized that the future wasn't the only thing that mattered. It was the moments they shared now, the quiet understanding between them, the simple kindness of the people around her. For so long, she had focused on surviving, on getting through the next day. But now, she felt something different. She felt as though she could start to rebuild, to create a life that was her own, one step at a time. The sky was growing darker, and the stars were beginning to appear above them. James turned to her, his expression soft. "You know," he said, "I think we're both here for a reason. Maybe not to understand it right away, but to live through it, to find something in all of this." Sarah smiled, feeling the truth in his words. "Maybe you're right," she said, her voice steady with a new sense of certainty. "Maybe we're here to make the most of it. Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a peaceful understanding, a moment shared between two people who had found something worth holding on to. As the night fell around them, Sarah felt a sense of calm settle deep inside her. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. She was ready to live again, ready to build something new from the ashes of her past. And for the first time in a long time, she was no longer defined by what had been lost. She was defined by what she was ready to create.